Remember when Saturday nights meant a tiny spaceship, a jungle full of house cats the size of tanks, and a cast of 7 trying not to get stepped on? For 2 seasons, Land of the Giants looked like just another shiny Irwin Allen adventure. But behind the cameras, things were a whole lot stranger than viewers ever realized. A show that broke the bank before a single episode aired, a boy actor secretly doubled because he grew up too fast, and a cancellation that had nothing to do with the ratings everyone assumed killed it. Today we are counting down 15 weird facts about Land of the Giants that even longtime fans might not know. So hit that like button, subscribe if you have not already, and let us know your favorite Spindrift memory in the comments. Now let us get into the countdown with number 15. Number 15, a space liner built for almost nobody. The Spindrift, the doomed suborbital transport at the center of the whole series, was supposed to be a scheduled passenger flight from Los Angeles to London in the then futuristic year of 1983, only to get dragged off course through a mysterious dimension lock. But here is the strange part. The ship was designed to carry only 4 passengers. For a commercial airliner of the future, that is a baffling business model, and more than one critic over the years has pointed out that no airline would stay solvent with a 4-seat capacity. But from Irwin Allen's point of view behind the camera, the math made perfect sense. Add a captain, a co-pilot, and a stewardess to those 4 passengers, and you land on exactly 7 regular characters, Allen's favorite ensemble size. It is the same number he used on Lost in Space. So yeah, the Spindrift was never really built for realistic air travel. It was built to solve a casting spreadsheet, and the science fiction justification came second. And here is a detail that rarely gets mentioned. The Giants themselves were written with technology that leapfrogged 20th century Earth in some ways, and lagged behind it in others, including cloning, force fields, androids, and teleportation devices, while somehow still lacking basic microelectronics or crude space travel of their own. That contradiction meant the tiny castaways could never simply borrow their way home, no matter how advanced their giant captors looked on the surface. Land of the Giants was actually the 4th science fiction series Irwin Allen produced for television in a row, and by this point, the 7-person survival formula was less a fresh idea than a proven house style he simply kept dusting off and reapplying to a new setting. Number 14, a rich giant's mansion you have already seen before. Because building enormous custom sets for every single giant location would have bankrupted the show twice over, the production leaned hard on a trick Irwin Allen had already used on the time tunnel, pulling stock footage straight out of the 20th century Fox film vault. The most famous example shows up in the episode Collector's Item, where the exterior of a wealthy giant's estate is, believe it or not, footage of Wayne Manor recycled straight from the Batman television series. Eagle-eyed viewers who grew up on both shows have been catching that reused mansion for decades. The Giants' entire society was written to resemble 1960s America almost exactly, complete with a police force, private hospitals, prisons, a state governor, radio and television broadcasts, a zoo, jazz clubs, and even a racetrack, which made borrowed Fox footage blend in far more easily than it had any right to. Whenever a script called for something sprawling, expensive, or hard to build at giant scale, editors simply checked what the studio already had sitting on a shelf first. That same giant government was also written as quietly authoritarian, tolerating capitalism and everyday freedoms while refusing to allow any real political dissent, and it offered standing rewards for the capture of the little people, treating them less like refugees and more like a curiosity to be studied, cataloged, and occasionally exploited by whichever giant found them first. Everyday giant life on screen included vaudeville-style theaters, chess games, and American-style automobiles rolling down oversized streets, all deliberately familiar touches that made it that much easier for editors to slip in a recycled shot from an entirely different Fox production without viewers batting an eye. Number 13. A single spark plug pretending to be several. The show's signature gimmick was making its human-sized cast look genuinely tiny next to household objects, and that illusion cost real money. Even with a production budget that was already unheard of for 1968 television, some episodes still had to fake abundance out of scarcity. In one memorable sequence involving a row of giant spark plugs, the crew could only actually afford to build one oversized prop. Through clever camera angles, repositioning, and editing, that single spark plug was made to stand in for what appears on screen to be several identical ones lined up together. It is a magic trick hiding in plain sight, and once you know to look for it, you start noticing similar sleight of hand throughout the series. Other giant-sized items got the same careful treatment, including a rubber slice of bread carved from a slab roughly 4 feet across and a giant revolver built to a scale of 9 feet long. And what makes it even funnier is that fans who binge the series today still catch odd little inconsistencies, where a prop that is supposed to be exactly 12 times normal size clearly is not, a permanent side effect of stretching an ambitious budget across so many oversized builds. Everyday objects turned into makeshift weapons, too, with an oversized safety pin doubling as a working spear in more than one tense encounter. Proof that the prop department could stretch a single household item across an entire episode's worth of danger. Building convincing giant-scale props at all was already a specialty craft in 1968, and the crew's habit of reusing, repainting, and repurposing pieces from one script to the next became one of the quiet running jokes among people who worked on the series for its full 2-season run. Number 12. 3 composers before the theme you actually remember. Music trouble haunted Land of the Giants long before the cameras started rolling. The unaired original pilot instead featured a score by Alexander Courage, composer of the original Star Trek fanfare, and leaned heavily on recycled incidental cues borrowed straight from Lost in Space. Composer Joseph Mullendore then wrote a second theme for the series that was also ultimately thrown out and never used. But once the broadcast version of that pilot, The Crash, was finalized, the whole thing got re-scored again by John Williams, who ended up being the 3rd composer attached to the project before a single episode ever reached viewers. Williams then went on to write a second, completely different theme for the show's 2nd season, mirroring exactly what he had already done for Lost in Space. Mullendore did not disappear entirely, though. He came back later and ended up scoring 5 individual episodes, alongside contributions from Richard LaSalle, Leith Stevens, and several other composers. Decades later, both of the abandoned scores finally surfaced on a specialty soundtrack release, letting fans hear the versions of the show that almost were. All told, at least 7 different composers ended up contributing music across the full run, with Richard LaSalle credited on 7 episodes, Leith Stevens on 5, Harry Geller on 4, and Irving Gertz, Paul Sawtelle, and Robert Prince each handling 1 apiece, an unusually crowded scoring roster for a series that only lasted 2 seasons. That much turnover behind the scenes was rare by the standards of 1960s network television, and it speaks to just how much creative uncertainty surrounded Land of the Giants before Irwin Allen finally settled on the sound audiences remember today. Number 11, an unaired pilot and a continuity headache nobody planned for. Land of the Giants was originally supposed to premiere as a mid-season replacement back in the spring of 1968, and the first 12 episodes were actually shot in the fall of 1967 under that assumption. Then, the network changed its mind and pushed the show to a full season launch that September instead. Here is where it gets weird. Those first 12 episodes had already been filmed with the Giants behaving very differently, moving slowly and speaking far less than they would in later episodes, since the original unaired pilot focused more on quiet character backstory than on creature encounters. When the network finally aired everything, it scrambled the broadcast order completely out of production sequence. The episode Ghost Town, for example, was actually the 14th episode filmed, yet it aired as only the 2nd episode audiences ever saw. Longtime fans who watch the series today, especially back-to-back on DVD, still notice the jarring tonal whiplash this created, as slow, near-silent giants suddenly appear right next to fast-talking ones from a completely different production era. The broadcast version of the pilot itself was reworked before air too, with several new creature encounter scenes added specifically to hook audiences faster, while quieter character-building material from the original cut was trimmed or removed to make room for them. Retrospective reviewers who later compared the 2 versions side by side on DVD generally agreed the new action beats were among the weakest, most awkwardly staged sequences the show ever produced. This kind of last-minute reshuffling left Land of the Giants with a genuinely split personality in its earliest run, one that still confuses first-time viewers watching the series in broadcast order today. Number 10. Filming in pairs to survive the budget. The optical effects required to mat tiny humans into giant-sized shots were staggeringly expensive for their era, and building oversized sets and props for every new location made costs balloon even further. So the production team adopted a strict cost-saving strategy. Whenever giant-scale sets and props already existed from one script, writers were briefed on exactly what oversized furniture, laboratory benches, or entire rooms were still standing, and encouraged to build entirely new storylines around reusing them. Episodes that shared these expensive sets were then filmed back-to-back as matched pairs, squeezing 2 scripts worth of story out of a single, very costly build. It is the kind of behind-the-scenes compromise viewers were never meant to notice, since each episode still felt like a fresh location. But look closely at back-to-back episodes from the same production block, and that giant desk, doorway, or workbench has a funny habit of turning up twice, quietly telling you exactly which episodes were shot together to save money on a series that never really had money to spare. It was a technique Irwin Allen leaned on across several of his other productions too, and on Land of the Giants specifically. It became almost a necessity rather than a preference, since the sheer scale of every giant-sized environment meant a single new set could easily swallow an entire episode's budget on its own. Later critical histories of Irwin Allen's 1960s output single out this particular cost-saving method as one of the clearest examples of how much creative planning happened purely around what the budget could physically survive that week, rather than around any grand storytelling plan mapped out in advance. It rewards close viewing, since a sharp-eyed fan can spot the same furniture in a different story. Number 9. A co-pilot who trained for the role without knowing it. Playing Dan Erickson, the Spindrift's co-pilot, required Don Marshall to sprint, climb, and dodge his way through giant-scaled obstacles almost every single week, since the entire cast frequently had to perform their own physical stunts. Scaling curbs the size of cliffs, dangling from oversized phone cords, and hauling themselves up thick ropes was standard weekly business for the little people of the cast. Marshall later credited his background as a football player, a track athlete, and a pole vaulter in his younger years, with giving him exactly the strength and body control the role demanded, even though none of that training was originally meant for television stunt work. Turns out, an athletic background that had nothing to do with acting ended up being one of the most practical skills anyone on that set could have. While some of the trickier, more dangerous falls still went to professional stunt doubles for safety reasons, Marshall's own physical conditioning let him handle far more of his own action on camera than audiences at the time probably ever realized. Guest stars who passed through the giant-sized world during the show's 2 seasons ranged from a young Ron Howard to veteran character actors like Jack Albertson and John Carradine, and while none of them had to train quite like the regular cast, every one of them still had to work around the same oversized props and forced perspective camera tricks that made the whole illusion function. The guest roster across both seasons also included Michael Ansara, Yvonne Craig, Lee Merriweather, Warren Stevens, Alan Hale Jr., and Charles Drake, a genuinely impressive lineup of familiar television faces for a show that mainly gets remembered today for its giant house cats and oversized furniture rather than its guest casting. Number 8, the Dr. Smith formula, reused on purpose. If the dynamic between conman Alexander Fitzhugh and young Barry Lockridge felt familiar to fans of Lost in Space, that is because it was deliberately built that way. Fitzhugh, a greedy, self-serving bank robber on the run with a stolen fortune, paired with an orphaned boy traveling with his dog, was a direct echo of the relationship between the scheming Dr. Smith and young Will Robinson on Irwin Allen's earlier hit. And the similarities went well beyond just the writing. Actor Kurt Kashnar, who played Fitzhugh, was given the exact same unusual contract treatment that Jonathan Harris had received as Dr. Smith. He was billed dead last in the opening credits, tagged with the flattering label, Special Guest Star, despite being a full-time series regular who appeared in nearly every single episode. Meanwhile, only Gary Conway received solo star billing above the title, with every other regular, besides Kashnar, sorted into the vaguer also starring category. It was a strange bit of billing sleight of hand that let the show market its cast as something extra special while quietly relying on all of them as its most consistent, hardest-working performers. The parallel structure extended even further behind the scenes, with actor Kevin Hagen brought in as a recurring antagonist, an inspector for the Giants' secret police who hunted the little people across dozens of episodes, functioning almost like a giant-scaled counterpart to the recurring military and government figures who kept turning up to complicate life for Alan's other stranded television castaways. Hagen's character became such a persistent thorn in the crew's side that he is remembered today as one of the show's most familiar recurring faces, even though he never carried the same episode count as the 7 regulars. Okay, we have to take a quick pause because if you are enjoying these behind-the-scenes stories, do us a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe, and let us know in the comments which reveal has surprised you the most so far. Alright, let us get back to the countdown with number 7. Number 7, a merchandising blitz nobody remembers today. For a show that only lasted 2 seasons, Land of the Giants generated a surprising amount of 1960s merchandise. Author Murray Leinster wrote 3 separate novels expanding on the series, alongside 2 additional United Kingdom-only tie-in books, all published across 1968 and 1969, plus a separate hardback children's adventure called Flight of Fear from a different author. Gold Key Comics ran its own 5-issue comic book adaptation across roughly the same period. And no, that was not the end of it. The Aurora Plastics Corporation released 2 separate model kits, one depicting a giant snake attacking 3 of the show's main characters, and another recreating the Spindrift spacecraft itself, oddly marketed under the generic title Land of the Giants Spaceship, rather than using the vessel's actual name, later reissued in 1975 under the more accurate title Rocket Transport Spindrift. A metal lunchbox followed in 1969, illustrated by an artist who reportedly used his own face as the model for the taunting giant scientist on the artwork. Sounds harmless, right? Not exactly, since decades later collectors now pay serious money for these leftover scraps of a show ABC treated as disposable at the time. Even a Viewmaster reel and picture booklet got produced back in 1968, and it contains one genuinely odd mismatch, showing the Spindrift flying through the giant forest in bright daylight, even though the actual broadcast pilot has the ship crash land and make that same flight at night, a tiny discrepancy nobody has ever fully explained. Actress Deanna Lund, who played Valerie Scott, even got in on the tie-in business, co-writing short stories under the title Valerie in Giant Land. Number 6, an actor secretly doubled because he grew up too fast. Stefan Arngrim was only around 11 years old when he was cast as Barry Lockridge, the orphaned boy traveling with his loyal dog Chipper, and he stayed in that role for the entire 51-episode run. But television production timelines rarely cooperate with puberty. By the time the second season episode Wild Journey required a flashback to Barry as a younger boy, Arngrim had already physically matured past the point where he could convincingly play his own younger self on camera. The solution was to quietly bring in a double for those specific younger Barry scenes, something that almost never happened on Irwin Allen's other shows featuring child actors. In fact, industry trivia points out that Arngrim was the only young lead across all of Allen's 1960s science fiction series who ever needed this kind of stand-in swap, while his closest counterpart on Lost in Space managed to appear as his own younger self in a flashback without any substitution at all. A small continuity fix, but a strange little reminder that television production schedules and real human growth do not always line up neatly. Compare that to Bill Mumy, the other famous young boy from Irwin Allen's stable of 1960s shows, who actually did appear as his own younger self in a Lost in Space flashback episode without needing any kind of stand-in. And the difference becomes an odd little footnote in the 2 shows' parallel histories. One boy frozen convincingly in time on camera, the other quietly swapped out because real life kept moving forward. Arngrim's dog co-star Chipper had it easier in that department, since a well-trained animal does not really age out of a role the way an 11-year-old actor eventually does, making the dog, oddly enough, the more reliably consistent performer across the run. Number 5, a family full of famous voices and future soap opera villains. Stefan Arngrim's Hollywood connections ran deeper than most viewers ever realized. His mother, Norma Macmillan, was a prolific voice actress, whose credits included voicing both Gumby and Casper the Friendly Ghost, meaning the boy trapped in a world of giants had a mother literally famous for tiny, beloved cartoon characters. And what makes it even funnier is that his own sister would go on to become one of television's most memorably hated characters of the following decade. Alison Arngrim, whom Stefan actually helped land one of her earliest acting roles, later became instantly recognizable as the spoiled, sneering Nellie Oleson on Little House on the Prairie. Stefan himself kept working steadily too, later winning a genre film award for his role in the cult movie Fear No Evil, and picking up a recurring part on the modern series Fringe decades after his giant-sized childhood adventures wrapped. So somewhere in the middle of the 1970s, one sibling was remembered as the plucky orphaned boy fighting giant house cats, while the other became one of the most gleefully despised young villains in all of 1970s television. Stefan actually helped his sister land that very first acting role on the series Room 222, before her Nellie Olson fame ever happened, making the family connection to the industry a two-way street rather than a coincidence. Decades later, Stefan reunited with several of his former Spindrift castmates to record a special audio commentary track for a UK DVD release, and he later connected with Gary Conway online as well to mark the show's 50th anniversary with fans around the world, proving the giant-sized found family from the series stayed close for decades after the cameras finally stopped rolling. Number 4. A series finale that was never actually meant to be one. Land of the Giants never gave its castaways a proper trip home, and that is not an accident of fan memory. It is simply how production wrapped up. The final broadcast episode, Graveyard of Fools, was never designed or written to function as a series conclusion. It was just another regular episode that happened to air last once Cancellation came down. The true emotional climax, if you can call it that, actually landed a couple of episodes earlier, as part of a loose 3-episode arc that included A Place Called Earth and Home Sweet Home, before culminating in Wild Journey, which sent the Earthlings back in time in a desperate attempt to prevent the original Spindrift flight from ever crashing in the first place. But here is where things get interesting. Their time-traveling efforts backfire spectacularly, and in trying to stop the disaster, the characters accidentally create the exact chain of events that causes the crash to happen anyway. It is a genuinely clever, almost tragic paradox for a 1960s adventure show, and it means the series essentially ended on an unresolved time loop rather than any kind of triumphant homecoming. It was not exactly an isolated habit either, since several of Irwin Allen's other adventure shows wrapped up in similarly abrupt fashion, with cancellation notices arriving mid-storyline far more often than any tidy, pre-planned ending. For a series built around the promise of a desperate journey home, denying the audience that homecoming turned out to be an oddly fitting final statement about just how precarious the whole giant-sized adventure had always been. Fans have debated for decades what a proper series finale might have looked like, and the honest answer is that nobody involved in the writer's room ever got the chance to plan one. Number 3. The most expensive show on television, twice over. When Land of the Giants premiered, it carried a production budget of roughly $250,000 per episode, an unprecedented figure that instantly made it the most expensive television series produced up to that point, at a time when most hour-long dramas cost a fraction of that to shoot, according to figures later cited in the reference book, Total Television. That detail would come back to haunt everyone later. By the second season, escalating costs for oversized sets, specialty props, and complicated optical effects needed to mat the tiny cast into giant-scaled shots had pushed the per-episode budget even higher, reportedly climbing to around $350,000, a staggering sum for 1969 network television. To put that in perspective, that is roughly the cost of building an entirely new giant-scaled world every single week, down to oversized telephones, doorknobs, and furniture that had to be constructed, filmed, and then often reused later, just to keep the budget from spiraling even further out of control. Combining two different physical scales convincingly in a single shot, week after week, simply was not cheap technology in 1968. And that single creative choice ended up defining both everything audiences loved about the show and everything that eventually made it impossible to keep producing. Even the actors' own physical stunt work, covered earlier in this countdown, existed largely because building convincing giant-scale obstacles was already so expensive that hiring extra safety crews or elaborate rigging on top of that cost was often simply not in the cards for a production already stretched to its financial limit. This was, for a time, simply the most expensive show ever put on American television. Number 2, canceled by its own creator, not by the ratings. Here is the twist most casual fans never hear. Contrary to the popular assumption that low ratings killed Land of the Giants, cast members have said in later interviews that the show was still performing respectably at the end of its second season. What actually ended it was a budget standoff. Facing that soaring per-episode cost, ABC pushed for major cuts to keep the series financially viable for a third season. Irwin Allen, however, reportedly refused outright to slash the production values he had built the show around, unwilling to compromise the oversized sets and effects that defined its identity. Rather than accept a cheapened version of his own creation, Allen effectively let the show end instead, prioritizing the look and scale of the world he had built over a longer run on the air. So the series that always felt like it was fighting against impossible odds inside its own fictional world was, in a strange bit of real-world irony, ultimately undone by the exact same problem its characters never had to deal with. An oversized cost nobody involved was willing to shrink down to fit reality. It is a detail that surfaced years later mainly through cast interviews and DVD commentary tracks, rather than any official network statement at the time, which is probably exactly why so many casual fans still repeat the ratings myth today instead of the real story behind the curtain. There is something almost poetic about it too. A show obsessed week after week with an authoritarian giant government refusing to bend its rules for anyone, ultimately done in by its own creator's refusal to bend his rules for the network that employed him. Fans who grew up assuming the show simply lost its audience have spent decades repeating a version of events that it turns out was never quite true. And now, number one, a bigger life after Cancellation than it ever had on the air. Despite ending after just 2 seasons and 51 episodes, Land of the Giants quietly became far more beloved in reruns than it ever was during its original ABC broadcast. The series found a devoted overseas audience once it entered worldwide syndication, and it kept resurfacing decade after decade on American television too, running on the USA Network alongside Lost in Space throughout the 1980s, then later on the Sci-Fi Channel during its early years. Believe it or not, the show's biggest modern moment came decades after Cancellation, when MeTV brought it back in September of 2016 as part of a dedicated Irwin Allen Saturday night sci-fi block, with the United Kingdom's Horror Channel airing the complete series that same year as well. A complete 9-disc DVD set had already arrived by then too, including the long unseen original unaired pilot and cast interviews, followed years later by a deluxe soundtrack box set collecting music from across the entire series. So a show that Irwin Allen essentially let die rather than shrink down ended up outliving almost every other program that beat it in the ratings back in 1970. Generations of kids who never saw a single first-run broadcast grew up catching the Spindrift crew in weekend reruns instead, which is exactly how most of the show's biggest modern fans discovered it in the first place. And there is something fitting about that afterlife too, since a series so thoroughly defined by little people surviving in a world that was never built for them ended up doing exactly that itself, quietly enduring for decades in a television landscape that had already moved on to newer, flashier, and considerably cheaper things. The little show that simply refused to disappear. And there you have it, 15 wild and surprising facts about Land of the Giants. From a spaceliner that never made business sense to a creator who would rather end his own show than shrink it down, this cult classic hid more strange production stories behind the cameras than most casual viewers ever suspected, from a doubled child star to a giant-sized world that quietly outlived the network that canceled it. Which one shocked you the most, and which ones did we miss today, dear giant-sized fans? Drop it in the comments because we always love hearing from you, and let us know if any of these facts changed how you see the show. And if you want more deep dives into the classic stars, shows, and stories you grew up with, make sure to subscribe and stick around. We have got plenty more where this came from.